Good afternoon or good evening, everybody. This is William Daroff, the CEO of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. It's my real honor and pleasure to be with you all today. I said good afternoon and evening because three of us are in Israel on this panel. One is back home in the nation's capital. Should I let everybody guess, or I guess you could figure out? I'm in Tel Aviv. Irwin and Ann are in and around Jerusalem, and Michael is in and around the nation's capital. And it is a great pleasure to be with everybody here at JCPA 2022 for us to be discussing the panel on Israel and the Apartheid Label. And we have three very distinguished guests, and I'm told I'm not supposed to introduce them specifically because the information is in the program. And Glenn is putting the bios online as we speak, but there are three very distinguished panelists who I am honored to be friends with, and I'm sure we'll be honored to hear from today. We're looking at, as I said, Israel and the Apartheid Label. Our intent is to sort of dig a little bit deeply into the label, what it's all about and what it means, and then to move from there into discussion amongst the four of us for the first half of this session. And then for the second half of the session, we will open it up for Q&A from you all, from the attendees who are with us. So I'm just going to jump right into this and ask Michael Koplow. Michael, if you could break down the Apartheid Label, where it came from, and the Israeli policies that reveal it to be the canard that it is. And again, thank you for joining us. Michael.
Thanks so much, William, and thanks to JCPA for hosting this, and as always for having me. So, the Apartheid Label, we're talking here about a number of organizations that have accused Israel of apartheid. Human Rights Watch did it last spring. Amnesty International did it a couple of months ago. B'Tselem, which is an Israeli group, came to the same conclusion about a year and a half ago. And I'll focus on the amnesty definition and charge, not only because it's the most recent, but because it is the one that is the most extensive. And so I think gives us the best insight into where this is coming from. And for Amnesty, what they largely talk about is an effort on Israel's part to dominate and oppress another racial group, in this case, the Palestinians. And what they say is that Israel is seeking to oppress and dominate Palestinians due to their race, due to their nature as Palestinians, and that they're trying to do this anywhere that they control Palestinians. And they have a whole range of things that they focus on, segregation, deprivation of rights, unlawful killings, torture. And they say this all adds up to a war crime, a crime against humanity of apartheid. And obviously, this is a very serious charge and a concerning one. And I think it falls apart for a number of reasons. For starters, anybody who looks at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can understand that this isn't a situation of one racial group trying to dominate another racial group. It is a national conflict over territory. And what that means is that there are many things that Israel is doing that may be objectionable. And there are many Israeli policies that may be discriminatory and that may be wrong and that should be reversed. I can point to many of them myself and frequently do. That doesn't make something apartheid. It doesn't make it a situation of one racial group trying to dominate another racial group because of their race. And it's pretty easy to look at one specific, in one specific way, easy to look at this and see how quickly it falls apart. And this is because Israel doesn't approach the Palestinians uniformly, which would be the case, or at least would be the case, what you'd expect to be the case if this was indeed a situation of one racial group trying to oppress and dominate another racial group. instead, what you see is that Israeli policies are very different depending on the status of Israel's control over the territory on which there are Palestinians, which is how you know right away that this is a territorial conflict and a national conflict, and not a racial one, and not one of domination for domination's sake. If you are a self-identified Palestinian who is an Israeli citizen and you live inside the Green Line, or if you are an Israeli citizen of Palestinian descent who lives in Jerusalem, you have full political and civil rights, just as all Israeli Jews do. Again, that doesn't mean there isn't discrimination, but you have full political and civil rights. If you are a Palestinian who's a resident of Jerusalem but not a citizen, it means that you have civil rights, but not the political rights granted to citizens, because rights depend on citizenship. If you are a Palestinian who lives in the West Bank, it's going to be different depending on whether you live in Area A or Area B, where you're under Palestinian Authority control, or whether you live in Area C, where you're under Israeli control. If you are a Palestinian living in Gaza, where you are under Hamas sovereignty, but Israel certainly has control over the borders, you're going to be encountering yet another set of policies in terms of whether you can enter Israel or not. And so this really breaks down when you look at the different territory that is at hand here. And the last thing I'll say, because I know we want to get to other questions, is that even if you believe that this is indeed about one group trying to dominate and control another group, to even undertake this discussion without any reference or any context of Jewish history is really missing an enormous point here. Because I think, there are people who in a vacuum can look at Israel and say, okay, this is a Jewish state, and they're trying to maintain a Jewish demographic majority, and so they are treating Jews in one way and they're treating non-Jews in another way. One might look at that and understand why some people would object. But even if you are going to object to that and you aren't looking at the scope of Jewish history and the need for Jewish self-determination and the need for Jewish liberation, and the fact that Jews are the original refugees and the original dispossessed people and the original stateless minority, and the fact that if there was not a Jewish state, we would have a situation today for Jews around the world that would be very different and very much worse. I think it's very difficult to look at the effort to maintain a Jewish state, and Amnesty points to this specifically, simply having a Jewish majority state as apartheid. You can't look at that without the context of wider history. So, for all these reasons and more that perhaps we'll get into, I think the apartheid charge really does fall apart pretty quickly and pretty easily.
Thank you, Michael. Very articulate and very compelling as always. Let me turn to Irwin Cotler. Irwin, as a human rights lawyer, can you discuss the use of this language, the use of the apartheid language, what it means legally and what roles it plays, and where is the international human rights community on the use of the language to describe Israel? And then lastly, can you talk about the background on this label, going back to the Durban conference and the extent to which the international human rights community has been afraid to confront this problem?
Thank you, Bill. I just want to say that I share Michael's comments, and also I want to support, as he said, to begin by commending the JCPA for organizing this timely and significant forum. May I say at the outset that the Apartheid Label is not a new one. It was initially espoused by Arab countries who used it to underpin their thesis of Israel as an original sin. I'm glad we've gone beyond that with respect to Arab countries, but just in terms of its origins, as well as it was espoused by the former Soviet Union and was very much part of their own, at the time, anti-Zionist propaganda and organization of the Zionism as Racism resolution at the UN in 75. But what makes the apartheid label distinguishable is the increasing mainstreaming, normalization, almost legitimation of this label in the anti-racism and human rights culture in particular, and its espousal by international human rights NGOs, as Michael referenced. There are two tipping points for this label, and this leads me directly to your question as well, William. And the first is the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001. I have to say that when this conference was first announced in the late 90s, 1997, to be specific, I greeted it at the time with interest, if not excitement. This was going to be the first international anti-racism conference of the 21st century. Indeed, it was going to be the first international human rights conference of the 21st century, and it was going to take place in Durban, South Africa, and to commemorate the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. And as someone who had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement, in fact, who had been arrested in South Africa in 1981 in my involvement in the anti-apartheid movement, as I said, I greeted this not only with interest and excitement, but and anticipation. But what happened at Durban, to use an oft-abused metaphor, was truly Orwellian. A world conference against racism and hate turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people. And I say this as somebody who was present at Durban, both as a member of the Canadian delegation to Durban and who participated in the NGO forum. A conference that was dedicated to the promotion and protection of human rights turned into a conference singling out one state, Israel, one people, the Jewish people, for selective opprobrium and indictment. A conference that was to commemorate the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state became a conference calling for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. And as we meet, I can still see the marches. I can still hear the chants that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. I can still see the posters and the placards that mainstreamed that conference, which said, too bad Hitler didn't finish the job. Jewish students who were accosted by saying, you don't belong to the human race. The convergence of referring to Israel not only as an apartheid state, but as a Nazi state. For those of us who were at Durban, Durban has indelibly impacted itself, not only on our memory, but indeed on our being. I flew back from Durban to Montreal on September 10th. I awoke on September 11th, as we all did, to 9/11. One of my colleagues from South Africa telephoned me at the time, said something that I never forgot, and she said, if 9/11 was a Kristallnacht of terror, Durban was the Mein Kampf. And indeed, what happened at Durban is it became, as I said, a tipping point for the mainstreaming of Israel as an apartheid state. In the immediate aftermath of Durban, you had the following. Jews were blamed for 9/11. The UN Human Rights Commission, as it was at the time, now the UN Human Rights Council, singled out Israel in a series of resolutions for selective opprobrium and indictment. The launching of the BDS movement and Israel's apartheid took place at the University of Michigan in the immediate aftermath of Durban. And I still remember that a resolution proposed at the University of Michigan calling for a two-state solution if Israel were to become a democratic state, itself problematic, was defeated in favor of a resolution condemning Israel as an apartheid state, again, at the University of Michigan immediate aftermath. And then finally, and I'm just giving some of the snapshots, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, the repository of international humanitarian law, met for the first time in 52 years to put one state in the docket of the accused. That state was Israel. And I might add that the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention have met twice since. And the only state ever put in the docket of the accused by the contracting parties has been Israel. Again, I'm not saying, neither was Michael, that Israel may not be responsible, like any other state and like any other democratic state, for violations of human rights and humanitarian law. But the singling out of one state for selective opprobrium and indictment, and only singling out that state, what this was not just prejudicial to Israel, but all this was in effect eroding the authority of international law, compromising the integrity of the United Nations, corrupting the culture of human rights, and indeed demeaning the real struggle against racism, against the real struggle against apartheid. And I'll close with the second tipping point, and very quickly here, because it's known to all. The second tipping point was 2021. That began with the reports, first by B'Tselem, as Michael referenced, then by Human Rights Watch, referencing Israel as an apartheid state. Then came the Hamas war against Israel, which invoked this label, libel, and the fallout from that war and the weaponizing of the apartheid label, such that we experienced in Canada and experienced elsewhere the highest level of hate crimes ever against Jews in Canada, which became the most targeted group with respect to hate crimes, and a dramatic exponential increase in hate in the social media, where in 1 week alone, in May 2021, there were 17,000 tweets that Israel was right. And so I'll close by saying that in my report as special envoy, at the end of 2021, I spoke about 4 converging dynamics. And in one-liners, I'll say them as follows. Number one, what I refer to the fact that while we have to combat anti-Semitism in its conventional paradigms, it's sometimes referred to anti-Semitism from the far right, anti-Semitism from the far left, and radical Islam. That paradigm is no longer sufficient. What we were finding is that anti-Semitism was being, as I mentioned, with the apartheid label, and not unrelated to it, anti-Semitism was being increasingly mainstreamed, normalized, legitimated in the political culture, particularly in the campus culture, with an absence of outrage. Number one. 2, the globalization of anti-Semitism. So what happened in London and Paris would then be replicated in Montreal and Miami. The same convoy that went through the streets of London saying, F the Jews will rape your daughters. The same convoy then went through the streets of Toronto. The third was the marginalizing of anti-Semitism in the struggle against racism as a whole. I don't have time to go into it, but I can tell you both within and without government and education and training, combating anti-Semitism was marginalized as part of the overall struggle against racism. And the worst thing, and not unrelated to the apartheid libel, was the laundering of anti-Semitism under anti-racism itself, under the very struggle against anti-racism using the apartheid libel. So I'll end off here and come back with some recommendations as to what can be done in our next round.
Thank you very much, Irwin. Brilliant as always. It is now my pleasure to call on Ann Herzberg. And Ann, using your perch, I wonder if you could talk about the role that NGOs have in perpetuating and promulgating this label, or this libel, as Irwin has called it. How does it play into the narratives that NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are trying to create, as well as with other organizations that are part of this international delegitimization effort against the Jewish state?
Thanks so much, William, and thanks so much for having me to the JCPA. And before I just answer your question, I just want to plug 2 reports that I and my co-author Joshua Kern, who is a UK barrister, have published in recent months, analyzing the apartheid charge in depth, including both historical background and the legal elements of that charge. And I'll post the links to those reports in the chat, because I think the people watching would be interested in taking a look at those if you want to learn more about this. So as Irwin mentioned, in the past year and a half, we have seen an increase from what are known as more mainstream NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and the apartheid charge. But as Irwin mentioned, the charge is not new. It has been around for almost 70 years. And it really did start in the Durban conference. And when we look at the people who have been advancing this charge, it really is the same small group of people. So although Amnesty and HRW got a lot of attention for the reports they put out last year, they have also been making this charge for more than 20 years. What I think is new in this case is that there have been some developments internationally that these organizations are capitalizing on, and that's why we've been seeing these reports come out and why there's been a lot of media attention for these reports. So the first one is that in February 2021, the pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court issued a very controversial 2-to-1 opinion, telling the prosecutor of the court that she had authorization to open an investigation of Israel, even though Israel was not a member of the court, and even though the Palestinian Authority is not a state. So they have authorized this investigation. And then in March, the prosecutor opened that investigation. And one of the crimes under the Rome Statute of the ICC is the crime against humanity of apartheid. So that is one reason why the NGOs put the reports out when they did. Another thing that happened took place at the UN. So in May 2021, resulting from the conflict, the Human Rights Council passed a resolution establishing a commission of inquiry into the events. But rather than just looking at the fighting of May 2021, this commission of inquiry also added on language saying it was going to examine the root causes of the conflict. And the language of the resolution largely mirrored aspects of the Human Rights Watch apartheid report. In addition, they appointed as chair of that commission, Navi Pillay, who was the former High Commissioner for Human Rights during the 2009 Durban II conference. And she allowed Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former president of Iran, to give an anti-Semitic speech from the floor of the Human Rights Council. So she is now the chair of this commission. She has several times called Israel apartheid. So this is a rigged commission from the outset. So that was the first development at the UN. And I'll just add on this commission, and I can give some more detail in the Q&A, is that unlike other commissions of inquiry under the Human Rights Council, this is a permanent commission of inquiry. It is now in perpetuity, and it has the highest budget of any commission ever impaneled by the Human Rights Council. And it has a staff larger than almost any office at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The other important point about this commission, unlike other commissions that simply write a report and report to the council, this commission of inquiry is impaneled specifically to gather what they claim to be evidence, which will then be passed along to the International Criminal Court. So it's very important. The second important development is that in 2018, the Palestinian Authority filed, for the first time ever, this was ever done by any country, the Palestinian Authority, purporting to be a state, filed an interstate complaint against Israel at the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, alleging apartheid. Now, Israel objected to this complaint on the basis of jurisdiction. And significantly, the Office of Legal Affairs from the UN also agreed with Israel, which was very unusual, that there was no jurisdiction to hear this complaint. However, in May, along the time that the commission was established, the committee, known as the CERD, decided it was going to take jurisdiction over this complaint. And a couple months ago has impaneled a commission that sometime this year is going to most likely issue a claim of apartheid. So these are the very clear reasons why Amnesty and HRW decided to issue the reports when they did. It's clearly to capitalize upon these developments. I just want to add, however, the other thing that they're doing, which is quite significant, is both of these organizations now are adopting extreme rhetoric that we in the past have only seen from the very fringe of the radical Palestinian NGOs. So they are now adopting language from Arab nationalism from the 50s and 60s, as well as the Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda from the 60s and 70s, the Zionism is Racism campaign. And they are now repeating language. Their staffers are doing this. You might remember Paul O'Brien, who's the head of Amnesty US, gave a very notorious interview a couple weeks ago where he stated openly that Amnesty is opposed to the idea that Israel should be preserved as a state for the Jewish people. And they are also adopting language such as Zionism is settler colonialism. It is based on racial exclusiveness and racial supremacy. And they are pushing lines that we are quite familiar with from decades ago, river to the sea rhetoric, claims of Judaization. And it's also important to note, and Michael had touched on this also in his remarks, that these reports are ahistorical and they are based on many false factual and legal premises. And I just want to point out a few of them and then I'll end. Number one, they are claiming that the international community has decided, and also in international instruments, that apartheid has been detached from the South African context. That is completely false, but that is what they're trying to do. They're trying to decouple apartheid from South Africa. They are claiming, as Michael mentioned, that this is a conflict motivated by race rather than territory. They are pushing the claim that it is Israel that has deliberately fragmented the Palestinian people, completely erasing the history of the conflict, the invasion of Israel on its declaration of independence by Arab states, and in Egypt and Gaza, that the Arab states refused to solve the refugee crisis in 1949 when there was a settlement on offer, and for decades have let that issue fester, and that the Palestinians for the past 20 years have continually rejected statehood offers. They are falsely claiming that Israel has imposed a system of Jewish domination from the river to the sea. And also they erase any security imperative for many of the policies that they claim to be apartheid. They completely erase the context of those policies. And I'll just add that another element of these claims is that in addition to these security policies, the main policies that they are attacking in their reports are things like the law of return. So they're attacking the very foundational policies of Israel's Jewish state, which under international law, the international community from the 40s and even before that under the League of Nations endorsed the idea of a Jewish state alongside an Arab state. And so they're completely erasing that historical context and the international legal endorsement for the existence of a Jewish state. So it's very important to note that. And then also just the policies they're pushing, again, it show the extreme radicalism, full adoption of BDS, calling on the Palestinian Authority to end security cooperation with Israel, calling on countries to enact arms embargoes, and also significantly the rejection of any engagement in a peace process, because in their reports, they claim that any peace agreement would be part of this grand apartheid conspiracy and is merely a means for Israel to maintain this apartheid regime. So these are all factors that we really need to know about and really to push back on why these reports are so pernicious. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Anne. Very compelling as well. Very much appreciate your insight. And I'm sure we'll have another opportunity during Q&A. Moving to Michael. And so I'm going to ask Michael a question, Irwin a question, then we'll look and see the questions that are coming from the 91 of you who are participating in this panel, which is a great number, and I think an endorsement, as my colleagues have said, of JCPA's picking this topic. Michael, what's the impact been of normalizing the apartheid label on the American Jewish community and on the American Jewish progressive community and the progressive community in general?
I'll pick up where Anne left off. Anne detailed some of the policy recommendations that are in the Amnesty report, and I think it's unlikely that any of those policy recommendations that they have for governments are likely to be adopted anytime soon. Certainly not from the U.S. government. But where I think the real danger comes in, at least in the short term, is not in the political sphere as much as in the cultural sphere. The point of using the apartheid term in many ways is for the shock value of it, right? Because you hear the word apartheid and that right away seems like something that is a category beyond anything that is simply bad, right? It's something that's not just bad, but something that's unacceptable and has to be eradicated. And I think that it has made it very difficult, certainly within the American Jewish community, because American Jews are overwhelmingly Zionist. It doesn't mean that you must be Zionist to be Jewish, but well over 90% of American Jews express strong affinity for Israel and toward Israel. And so to take something that is such a fundamental element of the overwhelming majority of the identity of American Jews and put it so far out of bounds as to be something that really has to be fought against tooth and nail, of course, is going to have a deleterious impact on American Jews and on American Jewish life in the United States, and being able to operate in social circles. It's not going to be the case everywhere, but certainly I think in university circles, absolutely. Certainly in progressive circles, for years it's been more difficult to be in those circles and espouse any form of support for Israel and certainly Zionism. And this is not going to make that any easier. And if it really turns into a wave where any type of support for Zionism and for Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state becomes something that one must renounce to enter a certain room, then I think that in some ways, the report will have accomplished its aims, because I think that much of this is intended to have a social impact more than a political impact. And there are a few ways in which I think the report also makes it harder for things to get resolved. For starters, it makes it harder to call out legitimate Israeli abuses and legitimate Israeli behavior and to work toward a political resolution, because anybody who highlights Israeli policies that have to be changed now risk getting those used as evidence for proof of apartheid. And I've seen this. William, you are the king of Jewish social media, so I'm sure you've seen it even more than me. But I've seen it all over Twitter in recent months, where every instance of something that the Israelis do that they probably shouldn't have done is used as a data point for Israeli latest Israeli apartheid watch. It doesn't matter what it is, and that really does make it harder to actually point to things that should be pointed to. And this is a problem, because criticism of Israel is legitimate. I'd argue it's even a must. And the apartheid charge ends up being counterproductive in this regard, because it does make it more difficult to do that. It also takes away Palestinian agency, because if you're talking about an apartheid situation, one side is pretty much completely right, and the other side is pretty much completely wrong. There is no compromise when it comes to apartheid. And so it posits this situation where all of the burden on this is on Israel. Every misdeed is an Israeli misdeed. And frankly, if you're trying to ever get to a place where there are going to be negotiations where compromises have to be made, removing all Palestinian agency with an apartheid charge is not productive. And lastly, I'll say that it creates an enormously unrealistic expectation, particularly on the left, that Israel can be driven out of existence, because ultimately that's what the apartheid charge is saying. What it's saying is that having a majority Jewish state is itself an illegitimate act, and any effort to maintain that majority Jewish state is illegitimate. And so the only appropriate response is, like in South Africa, to dismantle that system. And hopefully we all here understand that Israel as a Jewish state isn't going to be and can't be driven out of existence. And once you're saying that there's no legitimation to be had with an apartheid state that seeks to maintain an ethnic majority, you are creating this incredibly impossible and unrealistic expectation about how the situation can and will be resolved. And ultimately, that's not going to do any good certainly not for Israelis, certainly not for Palestinians, really not for anyone. And so I do worry a lot about just the social, cultural, cognitive effects of throwing this charge out there, leaving aside whatever it may ultimately mean politically.
Great, thank you very much. Quite poignant. Let's go to Irwin. Irwin, can you talk about how the international community can push back against this libelous narrative and the label, and how that would play in with each other? What role can the international community have?
Yeah, let me try and do it in point form. The first thing is, I think it's important for the international community to unmask and expose the weaponization and corruption of the apartheid term. I mentioned Durban, and the reason I did that is because while we've had these scissors and paste and footnoted reports coming out in 2021 from the human rights organizations, etc. The determination of Israel as an apartheid state was actually made at Durban and metastasized since. As I wrote at the time, and would say again, that the worst thing you can do is in this world is to call somebody, and in particular a country, a racist. The very label supplies the indictment. And if any further proof is required, then you refer, for example, to Israel as an apartheid state, because apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity. If Israel is an apartheid state, that means it's a crime against humanity. If it's a crime against humanity, then it has no right to be. Indeed, the international community, in effect, has an obligation to see that it has no right to be. So we have to invert and turn this back on its head because, as I say, of the weaponization and corruption of the Apartheid Label. The second thing is we have to get out of the docket of the accused in this regard. And I think there are a few points that the International Human Rights Committee should be making in concert with those that we might be making this evening. The first thing is to affirm the notion of the Jewish people as being a prototypical indigenous people, a people that still inhabits the same land, embraces the same religion, studies the same indigenous Torah, Passover's message and metaphor for that right now, hearkens to the same indigenous prophets, speaks the same indigenous language, Hebrew, and bears the same indigenous name as we did 3,500 years ago. So that sense of indigeneity, I think, is important. I'm not ruling out, nor am I in any way competing with indigeneity of Arabs. I'm just saying that the real issue here is affirming the indigeneity of the Jewish people in its indigenous homeland. The second thing is that Israel and the Jewish people here are a prototypical anti-colonialist people. That is to say, a people that have been displaced, enslaved, Passover, another metaphor here, assaulted, cleansed, exiled, etc., for a millennia. And so what we have now are witnessing the return of an indigenous people to its indigenous homeland after centuries of being victims of colonization. The third is to affirm, and this was Anne mentioned this, the international legal underpinnings of an indigenous people in its indigenous homeland. Whether you go from Balfour to the Treaty of Sèvres to San Remo to League of Nations to the UN Charter, the international birth certificate of Israel, the use of the language of reconstituting the Jewish people in its indigenous homeland, it's international law language. It's not my language. And we have to have the international human rights community recognize and reaffirm this. And the final thing on this particular point is to affirm the Jewish people as a multi-racial, as a multi-ethnic, as a multicultural, as a multi-linguistic Jewish people, then in order to rebut the absurdity that this is a racial conflict and the domination of one race over another. And finally, I think it's important to have the international community, the Human Rights Committee, join in unmasking and exposing the Apartheid Label is not one that is simply prejudicial to Israel and the Jewish people, though that would be bad enough. It's prejudicial for the reasons that have been mentioned before, for an Israeli-Palestinian peace. It robs the Palestinian people of any sense of agency and independence. The utter sanitizing in these reports by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International of any reference to incitement or rejectionism or terrorism by those engaged in that with regard to Israel is really, I would say, a patronizing bigotry of no expectations with regard to the Palestinian people. I take the Palestinian people and their right to self-determination and their right to statehood seriously. The international community should do that as well and reject these patronizing approaches or the bigotry of soft expectations. And finally, we need to call out the Apartheid Label as not simply one being prejudicial to Israel and the Jewish people, though that would be bad enough. It's prejudicial to the integrity of the United Nations. It's prejudicial to the authority of international law. It's prejudicial to the culture of human rights, prejudicial to the struggle against racism itself. And I'd like to see the international community undertake some initiatives that Canada has taken in this regard. We held the first ever national summit to combat anti-Semitism under the auspices of the Canadian government with all party parliamentary representation, with a diverse representation of civil society, in which the Apartheid Label was called out, and it was called out by a broad spectrum of the community. And we need to call out as well, and the human rights community has a responsibility here, not just a role, the singling out of Israel for selective opprobrium and indictment in the international arena, as a resolution adopted by the Canadian Parliament unanimously in February 2015. I was a parliamentarian at the time. I was happy to move it, but unanimous adoption said the following: criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, and saying so is wrong. But singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is hateful and discriminatory and anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest. And I think we need to mobilize the international human rights community in that regard.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Irwin. We're now going to head to the questions for the remaining 15 minutes that we have here. Our first question comes from my fellow Ohioan, Mark Barsman, the chair of the JCRC in Cincinnati, who wonders, thoughts on the potential of the durability of the Abraham Accord participation can ultimately have to help change this narrative. So normalization of Israel's relations with its Muslim and Arab neighbors, how much does that push back against this narrative? And since you were one short on a question, do you want to start us off on the possibilities of the Abraham Accords?
Yeah, no, I think the Abraham Accords are really a significant development here. I think that is also partially the reason these reports came out, was to push back on those developments, because this is a very positive development. It is changing the paradigm in the Middle East. And so it's a very powerful way in which to push back on the apartheid charge. And so I think the best thing, would be to strengthen those agreements, and maybe also to, if possible, to have those countries, work with the Palestinian Authority to try to get them, to come back to the negotiating table, to see the benefits of normalization, that they don't need to continue down this path of anti-normalization, rejectionism, and to see the really positive, both political and economic developments that have resulted from the Accords. And so I do think it's hopeful. So, I completely agree that is something that the international community should be pushing.
Michael, do you see this as one of the dividends of the Abraham Accords?
So, I'm certainly all on board with the Abraham Accords as being a great development and having lots of positive impacts, certainly on Israel, certainly on the countries that have normalized relations. I think I'm probably a bit more pessimistic than Anne is about their impact when it comes to the apartheid charge. The reason being that the folks who are most likely to look at the apartheid charge and accept it are not going to be swayed by normalization between Israel and other states in the region. In fact, I think for many of them, it actually does the opposite, because they look at it and they look at that as proof that Israel is indeed discriminating against Palestinians because they're Palestinian. I think many of them look at it and they see the Abraham Accords and other normalization efforts as a maneuver for Israel to get out of having to engage with the Palestinians, and by using these relationships with other states as a way to sort of kosher their behavior when it comes to the Palestinians. And I think that also many of them don't necessarily, there's been an odd charge with regard to the Abraham Accords and normalization, which is that they're illegitimate because Israel is striking agreements with non-democratic states and other states that are human rights abusers, and that somehow this is actually simply a league of states that abuse either their own citizens or people under their control. Now, I reject that entirely, and I would assume that most people on this call, if not everybody on this call, rejects that entirely as well. But that narrative is very much out there, and so I do worry that when you have a certain worldview, it's easy to make every data point fit into that worldview. And I worry that when it comes to the Abraham Accords and normalization, it doesn't counter this apartheid charge for folks on the left. It simply feeds into it and gives them more data points to say, oh, look, we're right. And normalization demonstrates why.
Thank you, Michael. Irwin, Len Cole, former JCPA chair, says, and it fits in with this dialogue to give you a chance to jump in on the Abraham Accords. How do we get Arab members of the Abraham Accords to take a leadership position to repudiate the apartheid label as a lie? So I know, I think all of us have become experts on the Gulf states over the last couple of years and have had lots of interaction and engagement with them. And I know you have as well. What is there that could be done to sort of to expand the relationship to be one where our Arab, our mostly Sunni Gulf state Arab cousins will speak out and push down against these sort of libels?
Well, I think we have two dynamics going forward at the same time. One is the normalization phenomenon of which we've been speaking, which we want to both enhance its the range of adoptions and their implementation. And that's a way to counter the criminalization phenomenon, re-apartheid. And I think we need to speak with not only those in the who are part of the Abrahamic Accords, but others, that they have a self-interest as well as us having a common interest in advancing the phenomenon and process of normalization at the same time as it counters that of criminalization. But I also want to say something with regard to the Palestinian issue, because and its relationship to normalization. Last July, I visited with Riyad Malki, the foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority. We have a long relationship going back 20 years, and I won't go into that now. But when I met with him, and I hadn't met with him for quite a while because of the Israeli-Palestinian non-relationship, but I felt time had come to see what can be done. So I came to see him, and I said I was coming to him in three capacities. I said, the first is, I said, I'm here as a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. I said, I'm very concerned with repression of media freedom under the Palestinian Authority. I met with him right after a Palestinian journalist had been murdered. I said, because my interest, I said, is not simply, as you know, Riyad, in supporting a Palestinian state, but in supporting, for your own interest, a democratic, rights-protecting, rule of law Palestinian state. And media freedom is central to that. And his answer was, you're right, we will do something about it, we are investigating, etc. I said, my second capacity in which I'm here is as special envoy with regard to preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism from Canada. I said, and I have to say, I said, I'm very concerned with respect to the Palestinian Authority. I said, I don't like to come in a patronizing way. If I have critiques of Israel, I make it to them. And I have critiques here. I said, I'm concerned with the pay for slay. I said, that just incentivizes terror. And he said, you're right. We're in touch with Secretary of State Blinken. We're trying to do something about it. I spoke about what I told him was anti-Semitism, regrettably, in Palestinian textbooks. He says, right, we're examining these textbooks and we'll see what we can do about it. And then I said, and I'm also concerned about incitement, because incitement takes us down the road to terrorism. And he said, well, you're right about that. You remember we had a joint committee on incitement. You had proposed this. We set it up 10 years ago. We had Americans, Israelis, and Palestinians. He said, if you remember, the Israelis withdrew from it. I said, are you prepared to establish it again? He said, yes, I am. I said, which brings me to my last point. I said, there has not been discussion about an Israeli-Palestinian peace. I said, not the talk of a two states for two people solution, which is something I support maybe in the distant future. But we can have normalization as much as possible of relations between the Israeli and Palestinian people. I said, let me give you just two examples. I said, there's a common interest. There are no borders for this with regard to environment. There's a common interest and no border with regard to health. With the pandemic, I said, why not at least have the health ministers and the environmental ministers meet? I'm happy to say that within 2 weeks, the health ministers and the environmental ministers from both Israel and the Palestinian people got together. And I told them that I thought we should try to think about also a peace process. That's the last point that I want to mention here. I think we have to work on normalizing relations between Israelis and Palestinians and doing so as we did in health and environment in other sectors, that can help us take us down the road to develop a peace process.
Thank you very much, Irwin. Andrew Gelman asks, one of the key powers of the apartheid charge is the simplicity of the message. Without minimizing the complexity of the issue, what might be a simple slogan we can use to undermine the charge? Apartheid is a good bumper sticker. Is there a pithy 2 or 3 word response that would be appropriate and make a difference? Anne or Michael, do you want to go first? Or does anything come to mind from anybody?
I mean, I think apartheid denialism is one thing that would come to my mind. Just, you know, the fact that these organizations are really trying to decouple it from the history in South Africa. You know, I've spoken to a lot of South Africans who find that so offensive. It really demeans what apartheid was, is really one of the great human rights crimes of the 20th century. And I think we do need to push back on that. So, you know, that's one thing I would say, you know, and that, you know, and it's clear that they're using that rhetoric for political purposes. So they're exploiting the rhetoric. And, you know, really, what is that doing to the memory of what apartheid South Africa was?
Michael, does that have resonance for you?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm not sure I have a good bumper sticker, you know, to counter the apartheid charge. I think that's part of what makes it so effective, right? It is simplistic. It is meant to shock. It's meant to stick in someone's mind. I think that, you know, ultimately the way to beat it back is through detailed and persuasive arguments. But obviously, you know, you have to get somebody who's willing to sit and listen to them.
Right.
And, you know, I all the time, I wish we lived in a non-bumper sticker world. Unfortunately, we do live in a bumper sticker world. But I'll leave it to folks more creative than me to come up with the bumper sticker for this one.
All right, let me go to our last question in our remaining.
If I may just jump in, William, just for a second. I think
you have a bumper sticker for us, Irwin?
Well, because Michael just set off a bumper sticker for me, but I think we should try to just say that the apartheid label is really prejudicial to the struggle against racism itself. It's demeaning to the struggle against the real apartheid and demeans the apartheid, but it's also prejudicial to an Israeli-Palestinian peace. And those who care about an Israeli-Palestinian peace should really, the invocation of the Apartheid Label distances that peace and prejudices that peace.
All right, I have to have a pretty big bumper for that one, but I abide by it entirely, Irwin. Let me, for our final question, in our remaining 5 minutes here, comes from David Bohm, who is the chair of JCPA. So he's paying for the Zoom, so he gets to ask the last question. And it's a 2-parter, and I think that maybe Irwin, you could take the first piece, and then Anne, you can decide between the first and the second, and Michael, I think the second is meant for you. David's question is, could you please speak to the importance of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and also what we should do to get anti-Semitism included in discussions of anti-racism? So Irwin, maybe if you could start with the Ihra definition and its salience here, and you could pick up on that and or go into the anti-racism, and then Michael, if you could talk about anti-Semitism in the context of anti-racism discussion, that would be great. So Irwin, the Ihra definition.
Yeah, so the Ihra working definition on anti-Semitism is the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international consensus definition that we have. What is not so well known, it is that it is the most representative, that it was democratically adopted over a 20-year period. And as somebody who was present at the creation and part of that process, democratically adopted over a 20-year period by intergovernmental bodies, by governments, by parliaments, by scholars, by civil society leaders and alike. So I think the democratic nature of its adoption is something that has not well enough appreciated, nor but the fact, and I say this as one of the people involved in its adoption initially, is that it is anchored in a human rights approach. As Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, says, we need a human rights lens. We need an equality rights lens with regard to combating anti-Semitism. And the Ihra working definition provides that lens. In other words, traditional anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in whatever society they inhabit. the new anti-Semitism, the discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Israel and the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations. What is common to both forms of anti-Semitism, old and new, is discrimination. All that has happened, that has moved from discrimination against the Jews as individuals to the discrimination against the Jews as a people, reverberating back against Jews, discrimination against Jews as individuals. So we have an individual and collective responsibility to enhance the adoption and implementation of the Ihra working definition. And this was a major country pledge by Canada at the Malmo conference. And I'm hoping now that Sweden takes over the chair and presidency of Ihra itself, that this will become a matter of priority and principle for Ihra as a whole in the international community.
And I'll say that Ihra itself deals with the issue of calling Jewish self-determination racism is the violation of Ihra. And so that's very important. The European Commission came out with a handbook on Ihra just a few months ago, where they go into that in detail and show that Israel's legitimacy is a matter of international law, and to say that it is a form of racism is a form of anti-Semitism. So that's very important for people to point out. I think in addition to the more than 30 countries that have adopted Ihra and hundreds of local municipalities and organizations, I think it's critical that the UN adopts Ihra. Every single agency and body at the UN needs to adopt Ihra, because unfortunately, the UN really is one of the primary sources of anti-Semitism at the moment. And then also human rights organizations, unfortunately, have not been dealing with anti-Semitism in any systematic way for many, many years. And really, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch should be organizations that are leading the charge against anti-Semitism. But unfortunately, they've done the very opposite. I'll just say quickly, Amnesty, for instance, a few years ago, there were 16 resolutions for its annual agenda. One of the resolutions was to look at the issue of anti-Semitism in the UK, and all of the resolutions passed except that one. They explicitly refused to adopt a resolution to look at anti-Semitism. And I think we really need to put pressure on these organizations that they also need to start taking anti-Semitism seriously. It is a human rights issue.
Great, thank you very much, Anne. And for the last word, Michael, if you could talk about integrating anti-Semitism education into greater anti-racism efforts.
So, I think it's unfortunate that obviously American Jews are in a wonderful and privileged position, and at the same time, anti-Semitism is rampant. There are more anti-Jewish hate crimes than there are hate crimes in this country against any other religious group. Certainly, all you have to do is show up outside of my shul on any Shabbat, and you'll understand right away the dangers of being Jewish in America, in this diaspora that is literally the golden age of diaspora for Jews across Jewish history. And I think that people tend to look at Jews and they think that we are all white, privileged, wealthy elites. And A, that's not true. And B, even if it were to be true, it wouldn't change the fact that there is still an enormous amount of hatred directed at us because we are Jews. My generally optimistic view of the United States leads me to conclude that the reason most people don't understand this isn't because they reject it; it's because they literally don't know. And I think that it's incumbent upon us to do a better job of making sure that people understand that in many ways it's wonderful to be Jewish in America, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. And in many ways, it's very scary to be Jewish in America. And I think that we need to do a better job of articulating that.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very poignant to end this. Let me thank all of you, Michael, Koplow, Anne Herzberg, Irwin, Cotler, for a very engaging session. Let me thank the JCPA team, Melanie, Haya, Stacy Burdett, who've been helpful in putting this together. And let me just also say, for those of you who have your cameras on, it's really fun to be back to see Lois and Cookie and Stephen and Len and Ruth Cole. Reminds me of my youth. Great to see you all again. Reminds me of our youth, I guess. And look forward to seeing everybody again throughout this JCPA conference and as our paths cross. So on behalf of Irwin, Anne, and Michael, and the conference presidents, let me wish everybody a Pesach Sameach. May you all have a peaceful and healthy holiday, and great to be with you. And again, thank you, dear panelists, for for a very thoughtful session. With that, 1 minute late, I turn the podium back to the JCPA folk to take us to where we go next. So thank you all very much.